The reminder, Washington Journal is live every day at 7 a.m. Eastern. We're going to take you live to Capitol Hill now. The Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science is going to be hearing from Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, among those testifying this morning on the on the Justice Department's role in implementing the president's new executive actions on guns. The chairman of the subcommittee is Richard Shelby of Alabama, there on the right. Barbara MIKULSKI, the Democrat of Maryland, on the left. She's the ranking Democrat. And in comes the Attorney General. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
This hearing will come to order. Madam Attorney General, we thank you for joining us today to discuss the President's recent executive actions. As chairman of this subcommittee, I believe that it is my duty to the American people to properly oversee the Department of Justice and ensure that any funding provided by this subcommittee is used as Congress intended and within the bounds of the Constitution. It's clear to me that the American people are fearful that President Obama is eager to strip them of their Second Amendment rights. Let me be clear. The Second Amendment is not a suggestion. It's an individual right protected in the Bill of Rights that has been recognized by the Supreme Court. And with that in mind, this morning I'm very concerned with the recent executive actions by the President for two main reasons. First, President Obama, I believe, is far too willing to end-run Congress through executive action. The President has said that he believes that when Congress doesn't act the way he wants us to, then he must act alone. Our Constitution won't allow for this kind of unilateral action, and the American people will not stand for it. Whether through executive amnesty to thousands of illegal immigrants or increased gun control measures, the President has unwisely, I believe, acted alone. However, what the President fails to remember is that we have a system of checks and balances. A system that was created to ensure that power was not concentrated in a single branch of the federal government. The President, I believe, has ignored the Founders' system and accelerated the use of executive fiat in an alarming new level. Secondly, none of the executive actions that President Obama has proposed would have prevented the recent tragic events in our nation. Whether it's a terrorist attack or a single gun crime, I firmly believe that those responsible should be held accountable, and that we must work to prevent it from happening again. As we've seen time and again, this president used tragic events to push his political agenda. I believe that he's more interested in grandstanding and engaging in anti-gun theatrics than actually doing the work necessary to protect this country. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in San Bernardino, President Obama did not address our law enforcement's failures, which allowed those terrorists to live among us. He also did not look at making changes to our immigration system after it clearly failed us by allowing an individual who should have been known to be a violent extremist to enter our country. Instead, the president's immediate response was to propose additional gun control measures. Criminals and terrorists, let's be clear, criminals and terrorists are not buying their guns from gun shows, gun stores, or collectors because criminals, by definition, do not follow the law. Madam Attorney General, we live in a dangerous world, as you know, and the American people are looking for us to do everything in our power to keep them safe. The next time a terrorist attack occurs in this nation, innocent, law-abiding Americans must have the ability, I believe, to protect themselves and their loved ones from harm if they so choose. It is our responsibility, I believe, to preserve their rights and not limit them. I believe most of us know that this president has made no secret of his desire to restrict the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding American citizens. The American people deserve, and I believe they expect, more from their president. They also expect more from their members of Congress, and I intend to live up to their expectation. Madam Attorney General, the Department is on notice. This subcommittee will have no part in undermining the Constitution and the rights that it protects. Senator MIKULSKI.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I congratulate you on holding a hearing so quickly in the opening session and taking up a topic of the issue of guns and their excessive availability in our society. This hearing does tackle the very pressing issue of guns and gun violence. When the average of 300 Americans are shot every day, 90 of them will die, almost a third. We do need to change our nation's culture of violence. We do need to stop guns getting into the wrong hands, the criminals, those with mental illness, without infringing on the right of law-abiding citizens to purchase firearms. But know that I do support the president's measure on guns. He is within his constitutional authority to act, and many of these activities, like adding more FBI and ATF agents, have strongly been supported by this committee. I think last year's omnibus, under your chairmanship, sir, really showed our commitment to enforcing the existing laws and the staff in order to do it. I do look forward to hearing the Attorney General Loretta Lynch's testimony today on the president's recent announcement on guns and the impact it will have on the American people, and will it make us safe? No mincing, no message, no talking points. Will it really help the American people? Are we within our constitutional boundaries? We do respect the Constitution, and also, though, its impact on the Justice Department, on the ability to deal with this. We also will listen to the testimony of outside witnesses on the second panel. These are excellent people who are well-seasoned, well-experienced, and also a father who will talk about the grim things that happened at Sandy Point. No one's immune from gun violence, whether you're a congresswoman trying to meet with your constituents named Gabby Gifford, whether your children going to elementary school in a wonderful suburban community called Sandy Hook, whether you're just simply going to movies or going to a community college, or sitting in a Charleston church of iconic nature in the civil rights struggle to study the Lord's Word and welcome in the stranger to end in such a terrible tragedy. Our president was at that funeral, as he has been at so many, but what he says, we have to do something. So we look forward to this, and we look forward to what the President's proposals will be in the new year, the budgetary recommendations that he puts behind it. We are appropriators. We look forward to the President's recommendation. I'm particularly interested in strengthening the National Instant Criminal Background Check. There are backlogs. There are technological glitzes. People who want to go by the law are frustrated. We have to enhance the FBI's capacity to run background checks while we're asking them to do a lot of other background checks. And are there new ways to do this and to train local law enforcement? But this is not only a Justice Department problem. I just left the HELP hearing where we're holding a hearing on mental illness. And for so many of people who are victims of gun violence, the volatile combination of mental illness and access to guns are dangerous. Mr. Chairman, I look forward, though, not to me talking and listening to myself, but listening to the Attorney General and listening to this wonderful panel that you've invited to participate today. So let's solve the problem. Let's not get involved in constitutional arguments, and let's help our American people be safe and secure in their home, their neighborhood, their school, and their house of worship.
Madam Attorney General, welcome to the committee again. Your written testimony will be made part of the hearing record. You proceed as you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Shelby, Vice Chairwoman MIKULSKI, and the distinguished members of this subcommittee. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the steps that the Department of Justice is taking to reduce gun violence and to ensure smart and effective enforcement of our nation's gun laws. Now, of course, as this subcommittee well knows, our nation faces an epidemic of gun violence that has taken a devastating toll on communities throughout the country. Each and every year, tens of thousands of Americans are injured or killed by firearms in armed robberies, domestic disputes, tragically suicides, accidents, shootouts, and heinous acts of mass violence. From law enforcement officers shot down while defending their communities to children killed in tragic accidents, our friends and family members, our neighbors, our fellow citizens are being taken from us day after day after day. As the list of tragedies involving firearms has grown, so has the American people's belief that we must do more to stem the tide of gun violence, and this administration is committed to doing our part. The executive actions that the President announced 2 weeks ago, including the measures that I recommended to him, are essential components of this effort. They are important steps that are within the executive's power to clarify existing legal provisions, to focus enforcement efforts, and to spur innovation. I have complete confidence that the common sense steps announced by the President are lawful. They are consistent with the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court and the laws passed by Congress. For example, the Gun Control Act lists the people who are not allowed to have firearms, such as felons, domestic abusers, and others. Congress has also required that background checks be conducted as part of sales made by federally licensed firearms dealers to make sure that guns stay out of the wrong hands. The actions announced by the President, which focus on background checks and keeping guns out of the wrong hands, are fully consistent with the laws passed by Congress. Taken together, the new executive actions will bring progress on a number of fronts. By clarifying what it means to be engaged in the business of dealing firearms, we raise awareness of and enhance compliance with laws that are already on the books. By issuing new regulations, we ensure that licensed dealers who ship weapons will report them if they are lost or stolen in transit, and that those trying to acquire some of the most dangerous weapons through trusts or corporations undergo background checks. By enhancing our national system of background checks, we will be better prepared to keep guns out of the wrong hands in the first place. By increasing access to mental health care treatment with a proposed $500 million investment to the Department of Health and Human Services, also referred to as HHS, we will not only be helping those in need, but we will also be curbing gun deaths, the majority of which tragically result from suicide. And by supporting research on gun safety technology, we will be laying the groundwork for a safer future and drawing on our strength as the most technologically advanced nation on earth. The steps that I have outlined and the actions that President Obama has described are all well-reasoned measures, well within existing legal authorities, and built on work that is already underway. They clarify laws that are already on the books, because clear notice will help ensure that those laws are followed. They direct important resources to our law enforcement agents, because these men and women deserve to have the support they need to do their difficult jobs effectively. And they lay the groundwork for state governments to more easily provide information to our background check system and for helping people with mental illness gain access to care. Because in addition to helping people get the treatment they need, we must make sure we keep guns out of the hands of those who are prohibited by law from having them. And they invest in research and promising technology that will make weapons safer. Because problem solving through innovation has always been one of our country's greatest strengths. Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairwoman MIKULSKI, I am confident that these actions will help to make our people safer, our communities more secure, and our law enforcement more effective. But I also have no illusions that these measures by themselves will end gun violence in America. At a time when there is so much work to be done and so much capacity for progress, there are many areas where only Congress can act. We would welcome the opportunity to work with you to further these goals. And that is why I am so grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you today about how we can work together to reduce gun violence in this country. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in the days ahead as we discuss how to keep our promise to protect and defend every American's right to safety and security and to life and liberty. At this time, I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Attorney General, as I said earlier, the Constitution's not a suggestion. You would agree with that, would you not? That the Constitution of the United States is not a suggestion.
Mr. Chairman, I agree that it is the law of the land and the law that we're all sworn to uphold.
The rights that it conveys to the people of this nation are not recommendations. You would agree with that, would you?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you on that as well as your previous proposition.
And the Constitution obviously the Second Amendment is part of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, right?
It is an important part of the first set of amendments, that Bill of Rights.
And do you believe that the rights granted by the Second Amendment are equally as important as those granted by the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, and so forth? And would you say that it's all an integral part of the Constitution?
Senator, I believe the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments are indeed an integral part of the Constitution, as well as are the case laws that seek to interpret them.
Okay. Madam Attorney General, you said that you work closely with the President to craft these executive actions, to go as far as the President can legally go without overstepping. While we may disagree about whether or not the President has overstepped, and I'm sure we would, I'm concerned that the President is slowly but chipping away at our Second Amendment rights. Can you guarantee us, Madam Attorney General, that there is legal authority for the President to take the actions that he has taken, and can you provide the specific laws or court cases that support their position?
Well, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the recommendations that I made to the President, as indicated in my earlier remarks, I believe that they are consistent both with the Constitution and existing case law that interprets the Constitution, specifically the Heller case handed down by the Supreme Court that defined the Second Amendment and clarified the individual's right to bear arms, as well as the agency's right to promulgate guidance therefrom as well. With respect to the actions taken, I am confident that they are consistent with the laws of the land. They are within the President's authority because they seek to enforce the existing laws. They seek to strengthen the provisions that Congress has directed that we undertake to keep the American people safe, such as the NICS background system. They seek to enhance protections for those who have mental illness, providing greater treatment for them, another goal that I know this subcommittee supports.
Each time there's a mass shooting, the issue of expanded background checks re-enters the public debate. I think we must look at the facts, and the facts are that most of those actions are carried out by individuals that would not have been prevented by obtaining a firearm. The Sandy Hook crimes were committed by a young man who shot his mother and stole her guns. Now, Madam Attorney General, would a background check have prevented that horrible tragedy? The Virginia Tech shooter actually passed a background check to get his guns, much like those that committed similar crimes at Fort Hood, Aurora, Chattanooga, and the list would go on and on. More recently, the terrorists responsible for the attacks in San Bernardino obtained their guns through a straw purchase, which means a background check would not have helped them either. Yet we keep coming back to this issue. Madam Attorney General, could you walk through these examples and tell us how having more federal firearms licensees would have altered the outcome of those events?
Mr. Chairman, as I indicated, I do not believe that we're able to look back and find a specific measure that would prevent a specific crime, but that does not mean we must not seek to prevent future tragedies. With respect to strengthening our background system, sadly, the NICS system is overwhelmed at this point in time. And of course, as we saw with the tragic shooting in Charleston, that individual information was submitted, but because of a series of glitches through experienced and well-meaning examiners, the information needed was not discovered in time to prevent that. The licensed firearm dealers who submit this information deserve the best and most efficient NICS system that we can provide them. The individuals who submit their information and wait for that response also deserve the most efficient system that we can provide them. And certainly the measures that we are discussing today, for example, increasing the number of examiners for the NICS system, of course a matter directly related to our appropriations, seek to serve that important end. With respect to other tragedies, again, because as I look through the panoply of criminal laws, which give us a way to protect people and vindicate the rights of those who have been the victims of crime, yet have not yet found a way to erase the human condition that leads to crime, of course, we are committed to doing everything we can, looking forward to making sure that our gun laws are effectively enforced and that our American people are kept as safe as possible.
Madam Attorney General, as we look back in some of these tragedies, and they're real tragedies, which of these individuals bought their gun from a gun show, and which of these criminals purchased their gun illegally online? I don't believe they did they?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not able to give you that information now, but what I can indicate is that with respect to the clarifications on who is required to seek a license as a federally licensed firearms dealer, that this is in response to inquiries that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives receives on a regular basis as they operate within gun shows to provide information and guidance. And they often receive telephonic inquiries as well from individuals seeking to comply with the law who want to know what are the standards, what are the things that determine whether or not they need to, in fact, apply for a license.
The area of new standards for gun dealers. A recent New York Times article states that the President's plan on gun control would require officials from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to begin contacting gun sellers to let them know of new standards to clarify who would be considered a regulated dealer. The article goes on to suggest that the changes are particularly meant for online gun merchants who avoid conducting background checks in spite of making, quote, high-volume gun sales through certain websites. Madam Attorney General, the law requires that anyone selling guns for profits, which I believe would be high-volume gun sales, to have a federal firearms license. However, you're quoted in the article as saying, the article in the New York Times, right now, your words, it's really an internet loophole. Is this really a loophole in the law, or it's a failure of enforcement?
Well, Senator, I typically do not comment on news articles and would prefer to provide you my own response to that particular issue. With respect to internet sales, they are increasing. not only do we see an increase in sales at the typical commercial level at which the average consumer may in fact appropriately buy a number of commodities, including firearms, we also see firearm sales growing on what is called the dark net. That is the particular part of the internet not accessible to the average consumer, but where illicit transactions are primarily held. These are not transactions where average law-abiding citizens are seeking to acquire a firearm lawfully and through the traditional process. These are internet sales where criminals are seeking to acquire firearms, but through which they can harm our American citizens. This is not a loophole per se, but it is an area of enforcement that the ATF has been focused on. As you indicated, with respect to the individuals who operate at gun shows, flea markets, and the like, there will be an educational component to the guidance. This information will be provided to them. They will be allowed to ask questions, and we believe that this will increase compliance and, frankly, lessen confusion among those individuals seeking to comply with the law. But where individuals operate on the dark net, primarily in illicit transactions, it will also put them on notice so that if enforcement actions need to be taken, there can be no discussion that they simply were not aware of this particular provision.
Madam Attorney General, I believe what we really should be talking about, not just here today, but across America, is how to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and violent offenders. This is an uphill battle, I believe, if the President continues to focus on eroding Second Amendment rights while commuting the sentences of criminals with firearm convictions. And while we can debate, and we will debate, the issue of mandatory minimum sentences, the President's actions to commute sentences of individuals convicted of illegally possessing a firearm is disturbing. I don't know, Madam Attorney General, I don't know these individuals and why the President feels that they need shorter sentences, but I do know this. This sends a message to criminals that if you commit a crime with a gun, this administration will not be hard on you, perhaps go easy on you. That's the wrong message. Aren't the President's actions, Madam Attorney General, sending a mixed message to Americans? One day he issues new executive actions to change gun regulations and then pardons criminals and gun-related convictions the next day. How can the President, and you, the Attorney General representing this administration, say he's committed to using every tool at the administration's disposal to reduce gun violence when his own administrator is not following through with the sentences of criminals with gun-related convictions? Does that trouble you?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't know the specific cases to which you refer.
We'll give you a list.
What I can tell you is that with respect to commutations or pardons, individuals who apply for those are carefully reviewed and carefully vetted, and only after consideration of a number of factors, in particular, again, there has been recent discussion about commutations of nonviolent drug offenders, and whether or not those individuals also have firearms convictions. I would need to know the specific case to which you are referring. But with respect to the President's Clemency Project, for example, it is a focus on looking at individuals who today would not necessarily have received the lengthy narcotic sentences they received, and who also otherwise qualify as nonviolent and with a particular type of record in incarceration. And certainly I'm happy to provide information to the extent that it's helpful on specific cases if you could alert me to them. I think that with respect to the issues that we are discussing today, however, again, providing clarification of existing case law, gathering the existing case law so that individuals seeking to comply with the law have in one spot an easy-to-read, comprehensive reference to what the existing law says qualifies as engaged in the business of dealing in firearms, so that they know whether they have to apply for a license or not, or so that their questions can be more informed, is in fact helping the American people in clarifying this important issue. Clarifying the issue of who needs to report a firearm when it is lost or stolen in transit allows ATF to begin investigations of stolen firearms much more quickly than we are able to now. Now we recover, Senator, on average of 1,300 guns a year from crime scenes that turn out to be either lost or stolen. And we don't know that information until they're recovered in the course of a criminal investigation. Learning that information earlier will help us to start the investigation earlier and hopefully find those shipments before they fall into the hands of criminals, which is, of course, the goal of all of us here.
Madam Attorney General, I won't go through the record here because this is the beginning, but I've been handed by staff here a number of people who were convicted of possession of firearms during committing a criminal act or using a firearm during a criminal act that have been let out of prison early and put us back on the people, which is dangerous. Thank you for your indulgence. Senator MIKULSKI.
Madam Attorney General, it's good to see you again. We welcome you back to this committee, and we from Maryland, we from Baltimore particularly thank the Justice Department for all of their help during our recent challenges in Baltimore related to the uprising we had over one young man's death, Freddie Gray, for which now it is going through the judicial system. And we're examining the need for additional criminal justice reform within our police department. But Madam Chair, over 350 Baltimoreans were killed last year. 350 dead, some of whom were little children who were killed as innocent bystanders, or there's a question of whether it was revenge killing. These were related, this was criminal work. The growing nexus of drugs, crime, guns, violence, murder. My question to you, when I look at the 350 deaths, what can we do in just plain English to keep the guns out of the hands of the criminals? I know we're talking about Second Amendment rights. Maryland is a state with enormous numbers of hunters, a gun tradition, particularly in our area. But you know, the gun tradition in Baltimore City shouldn't be that the drug dealer is the one who gets the guns. How can we, in either the president's new proposals or in current law, really have an aggressive effort on this issue of guns and criminals?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairwoman. I think one of the most important things we can do is make sure that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is fully resourced. Our request for 200 additional agents and investigators for fiscal year 2017 is something that will, of course, be coming before this subcommittee with the 2017 budget. We do intend to, in our spend plan, send up information about the beginning of that process even this fiscal year. The law enforcement priorities of ATF at this point, consistent with the Smart on Crime plan, are in fact to focus on the violent crime issue that you have just described, to focus on individuals who terrorize neighborhoods, who harm children, who essentially, through the unlawful possession of firearms, create a danger to law-abiding Americans seeking to live their lives in our vibrant cities. We are targeting not just the gun traffickers, but as my ATF director calls it, the trigger pullers, gang violence, places where we've seen an increase in violent crime. We are looking at ways to target our resources to focus on those individuals who are causing the most harm to our communities. So that is our first.
Do you feel that this is also due, this rising gun violence, not to interrupt, is related to the growing heroin epidemic? In other words, what's happened in my city, which is just awful, with these over 350 dead. Not only the injured, God forbid, but the injured. But this is in every major city that this is going on. So it's just not like a Baltimore bubble. This seems to me like an epidemic that's hit our big urban areas.
Yes, ma'am, indeed. I believe that the phrase epidemic accurately captures the problem of the increase in heroin and opioid abuse that we are currently seeing. This is a problem in many of our urban areas, but I must say it has sadly spread across this country. There are many counties with various densities, even many rural areas that are in the grip of an opioid and heroin epidemic. And with that often comes an increase in violence. There, our enforcement activities are focused on pairing ATF agents with DEA and FBI agents to target those criminal organizations that are bringing narcotics in and that are protecting the drug trade with their firearms.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Attorney General. My time is up. Senator Baldwin and I just left a hearing chaired by Senator Alexander and Vice Chair Senator Patty Murray on mental illness. Excellent panel, very excellent, superb witnesses. And I know that we're going to really talk about this issue of mental illness, people who are mentally ill getting drugs, this whole issue of privacy rights. What do you know? How do you stop? The Virginia Tech situation comes to mind, and we could go through other cases, but in Virginia Tech, that young man had been in and out of institutions. Who knew? Who could help? When do we intervene? So, and just their ability to get these guns. We also had a shooting at a Columbia Mall. We all have shootings. That's what's so terrible. We all have shootings. And so I look forward to hearing your comments also on the mental illness aspect. But I know we have excellent other senators here who want to get to their questions. I'm going to hear their questions and your answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Lankford.
Good morning to you. Thanks for being
Senator.
here, being a part of this. Let me bounce a couple questions off you that are timely as well. I served previously in the House of Representatives in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I was part of the committee when we went through the subpoena process to ask your predecessor for additional documents for the Fast and Furious investigation on guns. Those were delayed to us. Privilege was announced on that. As of yesterday, a court has told the Attorney General's office, hey, those documents need to be turned over by February the 2nd. I need clarification. Will all those documents now be released to the Oversight and Government Reform Committee by February the 2nd, as per the judge's order?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. We did receive that ruling yesterday. We are still reviewing that ruling. I am aware of that provision in it. We, of course, want to study it carefully and determine what appropriate steps to take and the timeliness of them. But I can certainly assure you that we will be either responding to the committee or to the court at the appropriate time.
So you're not saying yes or no whether those documents will be turned over in time? And clearly they've been collected. They've been collected for years.
If we'll pursue any additional legal action. We have not made that decision. If we had, I would let you know. And since we have not, I'm not able to give you that information at this time.
Okay. Do you know when that answer will come back out?
We will let you know, certainly within the time period that you've just mentioned.
Okay, one of the conversations that I had with your predecessor was on process issues with ATF and FBI. FBI and ATF have two different sets of processes for many investigations. Those can be combined to make sure that we have clear processes across DOJ on it. Do you know any kind of progress that's been made of late with ATF and trying to align with some of the FBI processes for how they do investigations in that process?
Well, Senator, I would need to know a bit more of the context of the processes you referred to, whether you're referring to either deconfliction or joint efforts. If you could provide that, I'm happy to respond.
Be glad to. We'll try to follow up on that because that was an ongoing conversation that he and I agreed on, and that there was a process moving on that. Let me ask about some of the guidance, as you've mentioned several times, for the federal firearms licenses. The guidance that's come out seems to be the same as it was before, basically saying if you're in the business of dealing firearms, then yes, you have to be licensed. That's nothing new on it. What we're trying to get is what is the new definition. The previous definition for that seemed to change during the Clinton administration, actually, to have a lower number, to say people that are kitchen table dealers that are actually selling to their neighbors or occasionally sell a firearm out of their own collection. They're not a licensed dealer. What we're trying to get is a clarification, who is a licensed dealer? When will that clarification come out of what you're proposing, and will it be a regulatory change or a guidance document?
Well, Well, Senator, the guidance document that has been promulgated does exactly that. It answers the question that you have raised. It collects information from all the cases that have considered this issue and provides, through a series of clear examples, a definition for when someone is engaged in the business and when they are not. And you are correct in the sense that the definition has not changed because the statute has not changed.
Right.
We are simply gathering the case law, the legal definitions that have been promulgated by courts in situations where people have been found to be engaged in the business, and also where they have clarified the definition of the hobbyist and the collector, because those exceptions also are still part of the law. Hobbyists and collectors are not required to obtain a license in order to transfer firearms. But it's important to note that this information has been scattered in a number of cases throughout the country. And as I mentioned before, ATF was constantly and still anticipates receiving inquiries from individuals seeking to comply with the law, asking if their activities constitute being engaged in the business of dealing.
So what will be the clear rule as far as how many firearms that you sell in a year time period? Is it over a lifetime? Is it number in your collection? Is it based on the amount of income that you receive? What will be the clear guidance for them?
The courts have determined that a number of factors are used in determining whether or not one is engaged in the business. And they've specifically said that there's not a specific number that makes one meet that test. Instead, it is the totality of circumstances. And essentially, if one is repetitively selling firearms, if you hold yourself out as a dealer, if in fact you do intend to make a profit, all of these things go into that calculation. The courts give them different weight, but because the statute, as you know, does not contain a numerical requirement.
Correct, and that's what we're trying to get at. See, there's a difference between a guidance and a regulation, as you know extremely well, and we're trying to find out if will be a rule promulgated in this or the guidance. I'll walk back through some of those details with you. I have one final question that I find very important. The gathering of information that's going into the background checks. The interstate, what's called the Interstate Identification Index, is that information used for the criminal background check information as well? Excuse me, or only what's going into the National Criminal Background Check? What's the NICS search? Are both of them used, do you know?
You know, I'd have to get clarification on that for you. This particular recommendation that we've made to the President focuses on strengthening the NICS system.
Which is part of my concern on it as well, because this has been an issue. I don't find anyone here that says we shouldn't do background checks and that database shouldn't be very effective. But if I can have just the pleasure of the chairman for a moment, let me just run through a couple of our states. In the states that actually submit information into the NICS system, federally, if there's a federal conviction for a felony, that's going into the system right away. But if it's a state felony, as I look through the listing here, Alabama currently has 0 felonies. You'll be glad to know that, sir, running into the system. California has 4,032. You'll be glad to know that's all that's in California felonies. Delaware has 0. Maryland has 12. My fine state of Oklahoma has 1, a very law-abiding state, clearly. Rhode Island has 0, and Wisconsin has 106. That's not very many coming from our states into the NICS system. And so the question that I would have is, and I think there's been common agreement on, what's happening between the states that they're not submitting the information into the federal system, or is the federal system so complicated to get information into that our states of all stripes are not submitting that information?
Well, Senator, I think that you've raised a very important issue. As you know, after the Virginia Tech tragedy, the federal government did reach out to the states and request a greater influx of information into the NICS system. Federal agencies are required to report information into the NICS system. States do it on a voluntary basis. And in fact, in the years since the Virginia Tech shooting, the amount of information coming from all of our states has increased by approximately 70%.
Right, in mental health, but not in the felonies.
Well, it is increased by 70% across a number of categories, and I wouldn't be able to break that out for you. What I did do also quite recently, with the recommendations I provided to the President, I sent a letter to the governors of every state asking them to essentially look at their systems and processes and make sure that they were, in fact, setting up the most efficient systems to provide information to us. The Department of Justice also, through its grants programs, does provide support for states who need assistance in categorizing the types of offenses that need to be provided into NICS, and possibly also making their own systems consistent with NICS. And we will continue to do that. We look forward to working with our state partners on this. They are very important partners.
Right, and I would say, I know I've indulged the chairman's time, and I apologize for that and going a bit long on this question, but I would say this is an area of common ground where we could actually work together on this, and I look forward to that.
Senator COONS.
Thank you, Chairman Shelby, and thank you, Vice Chair MIKULSKI, and thank you so much, Attorney General Lynch, for your leadership at the Department of Justice and for appearing before the Appropriations Committee again. I was encouraged in your testimony earlier that you want to focus on the smart and effective enforcement of our existing gun laws. And I think the budgetary proposals that you've laid out and the elements of the executive order that you've covered are strong and good attempts to do exactly that. I was pleased to hear you as the nation's top law enforcement official, review what you believe to be the well-settled constitutionality of the actions proposed in the executive order and the actions proposed in the budget. So rather than debating that further, I'm going to move forward to what you view as the most valuable parts of the budget request, something where this committee will be taking action. A portion of the President's announcement was the addition of 200 new ATF and 230 new FBI personnel. As we've discussed, I have seen tragically firsthand in my hometown of Wilmington what a dramatic spike in gun violence can do to disrupt a town and a community, to wreak destruction and pain and loss on families and whole neighborhoods. And I am grateful for how the Department of Justice, through its Violence Reduction Network, has provided additional resources. But I've also seen how access to better quality background checks, access to better quality ballistic information, and an increased federal law enforcement presence can make a significant difference. Can you explain in a little more detail why these new ATF agents and new FBI personnel, these new examiners and investigators are really necessary, and how they can help reduce gun violence, not just in my hometown, but in rural areas and in urban areas all over this country?
Yes, thank you, Senator. With respect to our request, particularly for increased resources for ATF, we have discussed requesting resources that would allow us to hire 200 new agents and investigators. Some of those would, of course, work on the increased paperwork resulting from background checks, but the agents in particular will be focusing on the violent crime problems that we find to be so troubling in so many of our cities and towns and neighborhoods. They will be working in conjunction with task forces of state and local officers, because we found those to be extremely effective ways at focusing on the hot spots in particular areas. It would allow us also to increase the amount of enforcement that we provide over the internet sales, as I mentioned, but to really focus on the violent crime problems plaguing so many of our cities. In addition to the agents that we are requesting, the resources that we are requesting and would begin using this year would also go towards strengthening what's called the NIBIN network, the Ballistics Initiative. This is a law enforcement to law enforcement initiative that essentially traces guns found at crime scenes as well as casings, essentially all firearms-related evidence, and shares that information on a nationwide basis with law enforcement entities. It allows us to make connections. It allows us to find connections between firearms, between those who are using the firearms. We are, in fact, opening a national center for NIBIN analysis, which will be located in Huntsville, Alabama. It's due to open, I believe, in a few months. And this is a tool that our law enforcement agencies depend upon greatly. The ability to track firearms is of grave importance. In particular, as I mentioned, the ability to track stolen firearms is one that we feel can protect our communities. Stolen firearms, and even indeed those who are lost, those firearms that are lost, do not end up in the hands of law-abiding Americans. They end up in the hands of criminals, and they are recovered during criminal investigations. Sadly, they are recovered at the rate that we are seeing them, 1,300 a year on average over the last 5 years, once the crime has already been committed. One of the things that these regulations would do is allow us to begin those investigations earlier and hopefully intercept those shipments before they fall into the hands of criminals.
Let me, just in closing, thank you for the very good work that your team has been doing in partnership with the Wilmington Police Department. John Skinner, who's the lead, and the Office of Justice Programs, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, has done a great job. I've gotten to see firsthand how better access to NIBIN, better access to ballistics tools has improved our homicide case clearance rate in Wilmington from 10% 2 years ago to 50% this year. That makes a real difference. And having access to world-class and timely analysis and insight of ballistics evidence has significantly improved the investigatory and prosecutorial outcomes in my hometown. I am excited about this work. It is my hope that on a bipartisan basis, we can invest the resources to strengthen federal law enforcement to tackle gun violence around our country. As was said by Senator Mikulski in the opening, it is a crime, a shame that Americans literally in their going to church to worship, going to see movies, going to college classrooms, going to elementary school, have been victims of gun violence, and we must do more together to tackle this very real problem facing our nation. Thank you, Madam Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Senator.
Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General, for being here with us today, and thank you for your service to our country.
Good morning, Senator.
Very appreciative. You know, I want to begin my statement by echoing what we've heard across the board, and that is the deep tragedy that we all feel when gun tragedies occur. It hurts us all, and certainly our prayers and thoughts are always with those most deeply affected. But I do think that acknowledging that there is a great deal of frustration by the unilateral actions that the administration has chosen to take to curb this gun violence. And part of the executive actions seem ambiguous and provide some confusion for law-abiding gun owners, and other parts seem a little bit more about political messaging. But that's not to say we should not take action, and we should first act, as we've spoken about and you have very eloquently, to enforce the laws that are already on the books. And I would like to focus on where our common ground is. As you know, much of the work that we've talked about today is actually conducted in West Virginia. The NICS and CGIS system is in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and the ATF tracing facility is in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Their efforts are invaluable to ensure that gun ownership is processed in an efficient and effective manner, and they each have proven their worth helping to track weapons and perpetrators of gun violence when crimes are committed. I've visited both of these facilities, and I've seen the professionalism and the deep commitment that they have to getting it right. You did mention they're overstressed and overloaded, and hopefully through the appropriations process that we worked through last year, we were able to increase the budget to make sure that we are able to employ more to make sure that they can successfully complete in a timely fashion the background checks. And so I wanted to get an understanding from you. The administration has called for an additional 230 NICS examiners. I understand in your statement, I'm sorry that I wasn't here, that you're going to go to a 24-hour system so that would that be 7 days, 24 hours? Is that your goal?
Yes, Senator, the goal is to increase the capacity of the current NICS system so that it could be responsive on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis. Currently, we are limited by staffing, and I believe that we are able to operate 17 hours a day. I actually am not sure if it's 7 days a week at this point in time. We also do have an electronic platform through NICS, so you may have seen that as well, the e-check system that allows dealers to get information quickly, and we hope to, frankly, improve that platform greatly. We are working with U.S. Digital Services and gathering information into how to make that system more efficient so that that also can be up 24 hours a day. Right now, there are times when it must be down for maintenance, it must be down to get information uploaded into it. And so that will help us with the backlog that we are seeing, and that frankly we've seen over the last several months, and we anticipate will continue.
Have you begun the hiring on that of the 230?
With respect to the 230, we do hope to begin hiring of that with using this fiscal year's appropriation, and then the 2017 request would allow us to maintain that. Because we need to move as quickly as possible, we will likely begin hiring on a contractor basis first. That's usually quicker than hiring full-time employees, but the goal is to have full-time employees on board. And as you know, for government employees, there is a significant, I shouldn't say significant, but there is time required for the the background checks and the like. So it will likely be several months before we have that full component on board. And this is, of course, a matter of great concern for us because the NICS system at this point is at a point where it's becoming increasingly difficult to, in fact, process the applications within the 3-day time period.
Right, right. No, I certainly saw that when I was visiting. But let me ask you this. Senator Lankford, I think, brought up an excellent point. You know, your ability to trace and to perform an accurate background check is only as good as the information coming in. And as we saw in the Charleston, South Carolina incident, the information was unable, it was unable to be traced to that individual. How are we going to meet that challenge? And is that training at the local level? Is it the NICS examiner? What happened there?
Well, as I think you know, the NICS examiners are dedicated and pursue their jobs with great conviction and commitment. In the Charleston case, my understanding is that the arrest record was located in one particular jurisdiction, but the query was made of another jurisdiction.
Yeah, so how do we get around
side
that?
by side, and because there wasn't a conviction yet, it prevented it from being in the court system. And so the examiner followed all the queries as per normal
as they could,
and the information was literally sitting in an adjoining county's sort of bucket, so to speak, and so was not pulled in that. And it was frankly heartbreaking to all of us who work on this matter, from the FBI throughout the Department of Justice. And one of the reasons why even then we began looking at ways to improve the NICS system. You know, the FBI director commissioned a report, and we have folded a number of those recommendations into this request. Being able to modernize the electronic database will be greatly helpful in making sure that all of the relevant jurisdictions are in fact able to be queried. If that could happen on an electronic basis, it would certainly ease the situation. Of course, looking back, it's impossible to say what electronic system could have prevented this glitch, but certainly going forward, that's one of the things we're looking to do in strengthening the electronic platform for the NICS system. Also, in terms of the examiners, making sure that they have the time to conduct these examinations and to provide a response to the dealers who call in. Most of this is still done over the phone. Most of the responses are still handled very, very quickly. Often the dealer will get an answer in that first phone call, but the difficult cases, the ones where you really do have to look and search and make sure that this individual is not prohibited, those often do take time. Now still, it's a system of which we are incredibly proud. Over 2 million people have been prohibited from purchasing firearms as a result of NICS background checks, and we think that that is frankly a benefit to the country and to public safety. So we are incredibly proud of the system, but we really do want to make it the best system that we can.
Well, and I want to pledge to work with you to make sure that the fine folks in West Virginia who are doing these, the NICS system and the background check, have the best technology, have enough staff to help them. It's a very stressful position in a lot of ways for many of them, and I hope that we can get, with this additional hiring, we will eliminate some of these loopholes that people are able to fall into and prevent those who shouldn't from getting a firearm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Madam Attorney General, you certainly look well, and as if you're not worn out by the job. I want you to say, I haven't seen you since your confirmation, so it's very good to see you again.
Thank you.
I'm glad you stressed that the President's executive order largely clarifies existing law, which clarification should make enforcement easier, and which enforcement is what people seem to want of existing law. However, you do have to have people to enforce existing law. As you have said twice in your remarks and once in your written remarks, ATF is requesting $35.6 million for an additional 200 special agents and industry operation investigations through ATF. But my understanding is that ATF is going to have the retirement of 544 special agents this year. They're eligible to retire. I can't say how many are going to retire, but it certainly appears to me that with ATF being an enforcement agency, that you're going to lose people and that that's going to have an unfortunate effect. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, Senator, and thank you for raising that important issue. ATF, like so many agencies, is facing a situation where so many of the talented agents are soon able to retire. We certainly hope that they will not, but we know that we will lose some. I think it's also important to note that the request that would bring an additional 200 agents and investigators on board still would not increase the size of the agency. It's not a request for additional FTE, so to speak, but the budget to hire to fill the existing slots that are vacant now and will soon be vacant.
Well, let me say this. I speak for a state that's now over 40 million people. By census, 39.1, and probably another 2 million that avoid the census. We want the enforcement of existing law. We want to see that ATF is staffed and able to do it. And this is the subcommittee that's responsible to see that ATF is funded sufficiently to enforce everyday laws. So I'm going to do everything I can on this committee to see that that amount is raised so that you get the sufficient number. So I would appreciate all of the data that you can provide me with. Thank you. The second thing are machine guns and other fully automatic weapons, as well as weapons like short-barreled shotguns. These are all regulated under the National Firearms Act. And it's been reported that individuals have been able to avoid regulation under the Firearms Act by applying to acquire these dangerous guns through trusts or corporations rather than, excuse me, as individuals. The number of applications for such transfers has increased from fewer than 900 applications in 2000 to more than 90,000 applications in 2014. Now, those the trusts are obviously being used not to have to register them, or not to have to have a background check, or not to have to buy them through a licensed firearm dealer. So how has ATF managed to keep up with this massive increase in NFA applications despite flat manpower levels?
Well, Senator, the reality is that it is difficult to keep up with those applications. For National Firearms Act weapons, as you've indicated, the silencers, short-barrel shotguns, and machine guns, there's an application process similar to a background check, but an application process. And it also typically at this point in time requires what's called a law enforcement officer certification. A local law enforcement officer has to also certify the person can do that. One of the regulations promulgated after going through the notice and comment period is a regulation that requires individuals who are seeking to purchase these weapons under the National Firearms Act to undergo a background check, whether they are using a trust or any other legal entity or whether they are a standalone person. Right now, if an individual seeks to purchase the silencer, a short barrel weapon, they have to undergo an application process similar to a background check. When they use a trust, they do not. The current regulation that has gone through notice and comment that is being promulgated as a final rule essentially closes that loophole and says that individuals using a trust or a legal entity stand in the same position as individuals standing alone. But what it also does is it removes the law enforcement officer certification requirement, because that essentially has been obviated by the background check, and that was an additional delay on the license. So with the information that we are getting from the background checks, individuals, whether they are using a trust, a legal entity, or whether they are applying as individuals, will have the same requirements and undergo the same level of scrutiny before buying a National Firearms Act weapon. And that is one of the rules that was promulgated within this past week as well.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted that you're on top of this. Of the 25 attacks of more than 4 people killed in the last 10 years, California has 6 of them. So I think watching machine guns and those things that can be used to attack others is really important. And I thank you very much. And I'll do everything I can to be of help in seeing that you get more ATF agents. Thank you.
Senator.
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for being here today.
Good morning, Senator.
I have a number of concerns with the way the President continually overreaches his authority. And something that really concerns me is the executive actions in this upcoming rule proposal by the Social Security Administration to include folks who have fiduciaries into the NICS program. This is certainly not clarifying existing law. This would prohibit them from the constitutional Second Amendment right, not based on due process, but only on the fact that they requested a family member or friend to assist them with their finances. I'm concerned with your department's final ruling that revised some of the definitions regarding being adjudicated as a mental defective and committed to a mental institution to now more broadly cover folks who seek treatment. I'm concerned because these were not changed through Congress, and now you couple it with the upcoming Social Security rule. What are we going to have? Please tell me what your department's plans are here. What is the Social Security Administration planning to do, and who will be entered into the NICS based solely on Social Security records?
Senator, thank you for raising that important issue. As you know, the current Gun Control Act does prohibit individuals who have been adjudicated in certain ways involving their mental health from possessing firearms. And currently, under current law, federal agencies are required to submit information to NICS about individuals who fall into those categories, involuntary commitment and adjudications of the type that you were discussing. The Social Security Administration is beginning a process of seeking comment through a rulemaking process in order to clarify who within the Social Security Administration adjudication system should also fall into that category as well. For example, well, I'll withdraw that, it's not an example, but they currently are not providing the information. And so the questions that you raise are very real and salient ones. And the Social Security Administration's process, which is just beginning, is designed to, in fact, solicit comment, get input as to which types of adjudications should in fact be provided to NICS and which should not. Because as we know, the issue of mental illness is not one that subjects every individual who has that issue to a prohibition from obtaining a firearm. And so it's important that we clarify, as other agencies have, which types of adjudications and which types of issues would require those records to come to NICS. So the Social Security Administration is beginning that process, and certainly we look forward to providing whatever input and guidance they request from the Department of Justice on that as well. One of the things that will, of course, be part of that is, as with all of that, for example, our VA already provides records, but one of the things that will be part of that process is making sure that any individual who may find themselves in that situation receives notice that that is a possibility. That is something that would be consistent with existing law and the Second Amendment, and also that there is a way for an individual to apply to have their rights restored, not just to own and possess a firearm, but anything else that might be a collateral consequence of a particular type of adjudication. At this point, I can't predict for you what types of adjudications the Social Security Administration would decide should be provided to the NICS system, but we certainly look forward to them going through the comment process and refining that area.
Good. Well, thank you, because that really is a real concern. I've heard from a number of police departments in Arkansas who've had equitable sharing funds recently removed from their accounts due to the Department of Justice's mismanagement of the budget. In a letter from your department dated December 21st, 2015, regarding the asset forfeiture program, it states that DOJ has already begun implementing cost reduction measures. What are the measures, and when do you envision the equitable sharing program to be reinstated? Can you explain the benefits of this program to the American people? I say this because it is an important program, and we're so concerned about violent crime. This is one of the tools that we're using very effectively in order to decrease that and fight that battle.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Senator, because I share your concern and also our regard for the strong working relationship that the federal government has with our state and local counterparts. Certainly, as a U.S. attorney, I was a direct beneficiary of their talent and their expertise, and now as Attorney General, I do all I can to keep those relationships strong and vital, because they are essential to protecting the American people. With respect to the equitable sharing issue that you've raised, there have been some budget issues there. There was a rescission from the department's asset forfeiture fund made in the last fiscal year. I don't know the exact time of it, and that essentially limited our ability to provide funds pursuant to equitable sharing. We are looking forward to restoring those payments as soon as the receipts to the asset forfeiture fund allow. We very much feel that equitable sharing is an important law enforcement tool. I know that there is a great deal of discussion about asset forfeiture in general. We have been working with Congress to make sure that we retain this important aspect of it while also addressing those concerns as well.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chair MIKULSKI, for holding this important and timely hearing. Violence continues to plague our communities. In my home state of Wisconsin, gun homicides reached their highest point in a decade last year in the city of Milwaukee. And while we finally saw a notorious gun dealer, once called the #1 seller of crime guns in America, start to clean up its act and be held liable for selling firearms used to injure cops, other gun dealers have rushed in to take its place. I hope that all of my colleagues can agree that we can and must do more to address this critical issue and more to keep our communities safe. Now, I'm a gun owner, and I support and respect the Second Amendment. But at the same time, I'm very frustrated that the Senate has been unable to advance common sense and bipartisan measures to bolster both the enforcement of our existing gun laws, but also to pass additional safety provisions. And in the absence of leadership on this important issue by the Congress of the United States, I have to say I applaud the President for taking small steps to strengthen the enforcement of existing federal gun laws. In our limited time, I want to call your attention to two Wisconsin matters. One that I noted in my preface, which is that Milwaukee was home for years to a notorious rogue gun shop, Badger Guns, which in 1 2-year period alone was the source of weapons used to shoot and wound 6 Milwaukee police officers. In 2005, it was the top seller of crime guns in the entire country, according to sources that I've seen. But the shop, which first opened in 1987, had been found in violation of federal firearms laws by the ATF as early as 1989. And subsequent inspections uncovered additional violations. A 2006 recommendation by federal investigators that its license be repealed went unheeded. And it was not until 2011 that the shop lost its ability to sell guns. Now, despite an active role by the ATF in monitoring this facility, this store, it was allowed to put guns into the hands of dangerous criminals again and again and again. So you made it clear in your testimony that the President's actions are not wholesale solutions. We understand that. But I'd like to hear from you how the steps that we're discussing today, including support for more ATF personnel, might have helped stop a bad actor like Badger Guns, and what more the Congress can do to prevent stores like this from contributing to gun violence.
Well, thank you, Senator. Certainly separate and apart from the recommendations I made to the President, as the subcommittee is aware, it is already a crime to knowingly sell a gun to someone who is prohibited. And what I will say is that ATF is dedicated to enforcing that law as well. And so where there are gun dealers, and it is a very small percentage of them that are in the category that you discussed, ATF does take enforcement actions there. Often the guns, through NIBIN or through other means we discover, come from the shops. As you mentioned, we learn from investigations that of shootings of law enforcement officers, of civilians, where the guns tend to come from, and that supports us. It's impossible to look back, unfortunately, and sort of recreate an investigative trail and say what could or should have been done in that instance, as I'm not familiar enough with that situation. But what I can say is that as part of the enforcement of the existing laws, ATF takes situations such as you mentioned very, very seriously. It is indeed not the majority of the licensed firearms dealers in America. It's a very small minority of them. But where we find a situation where a gun shop, such as you mentioned, has that type of record, it is something that would be subject to enforcement actions.
Well, I thank you. Obviously, in continuous operation from 1987 to 2011 draws some extremely significant concerns. And so, you know, obviously we want to see more swift action in cases like this moving forward. I've run out of time, but hope to submit for the record an additional question regarding an ATF operation in Milwaukee that raised significant concerns in the last couple of years.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Attorney General, for your leadership and for your testimony this morning. One of the benefits of coming in late is getting to listen to the probing questions of my colleagues, and one of them was Senator Feinstein's question about the trust in corporations that over the last 15 years apparently have been more active in acquiring weapons. And just a few questions. One is that the proposal by the President would sort of pierce the corporate veil and require the individuals who are actually obtaining these weapons to run a background check. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. Yes, Senator.
And are these generally, these corporation trusts set up to avoid limitations on owning automatic weapons, machine guns, or do they are applying increasingly with just handguns and what we would consider to be personalized weapons?
Well, typically we see trusts and other corporate entities being used to purchase the weapons that are not handguns, that typically one can go to a dealer and purchase fairly quickly and easily, but weapons that are on the under the National Firearms Act. They usually are the short-barreled shotguns, certain types of machine guns, as well as silencers.
Right. Now, it just strikes me somewhat ironically because the Second Amendment is seen, and I think appropriately so, as a individual right that Americans have, and to create corporations and trusts to be, and it's not alone in this area, having been a lawyer myself for a little bit, corporations and trusts are often created to evade, evolve, or illegally do something that directly can't be done. So I think this is a very sensible step and reflects the thoughtful way that you and the President have proposed these very sensible improvements on background checks. Another issue that was raised by my colleague from Oklahoma, and it was a very good one too, is the issue of engaged in the business. And from your answer, you rejected a categorical, the arbitrary number of weapons, and you reflected the opinions of the courts interpreting the Constitution. Is that the I assume that's the rationale, to ensure that this is constitutionally consistent with the court decisions?
Yes, Senator. We essentially have crafted the guidance to reflect what the courts have said defines who is engaged in the business of dealing firearms. And the courts have said that there is no set number. Certainly there can be large numbers of firearms transferred, but if someone in fact has a collection and is simply selling that, that would not make them subject to the licensure requirement. But if someone may be selling only a few guns, but if they sell them repetitively, if they hold themselves out as a dealer, that's a very, very different scenario. Essentially, it's not limited to where one operates relates, but to what one does that determines whether one is a dealer or not. And so we've collected the guidance based on court cases around the country into a document that we hope will be clear and easily understandable for people who have those questions.
So this is not, as I say, an arbitrary decision. It is a reflection of the court's view on the Second Amendment rights of the individual Americans.
Yes, Senator.
One other general issue, too, is that the effect of these regulations overall, clearly in a very gross sense, two populations, people who are exercising their rights for self-defense, for recreation, for hobbyists, et cetera, and people who are trying to obtain a weapon for illicit purposes. The effect of the President's regulations on both groups, my hope is that no impediments for those who honestly seek legitimate use of firearms and the right to do so, and reasonable constraints on those people who have illicit motives. Is that your?
That is correct, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Attorney General.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General, for being here with us today. I wanted to, before I get into a question or two about the guidance, just continue on this line of questioning about resources. I think we've talked a lot about ATF resources, but I wanted to explore a little bit more deeply about resources within the NICS system itself. And as we start to game out our budget for the 2016-2017 appropriations year, what should we be looking at in terms of the appropriations necessary for the Department of Justice to be able to do all of the things that we contemplate NICS has to do in order to keep up with the increasing number of applications, but also the increased coordination that we want to see to make sure that we have all of the records uploaded onto that system?
Yes, Senator, thank you for that that question. It's I think it's a very timely one as we look to invest in a system that is, in fact, one of our first lines of defense against keeping guns out of the hands of those who should not have them. Essentially, for fiscal year 2015, NICS performed over 23 million background checks. That number is increasing. In just this December alone, they received over 3 million requests. That's the highest number of requests on a monthly basis since the month after the Sandy Hook shooting. For FY 2016, our estimates are that there would be, we would need $121 million to run NICS. We're asking for an additional $35 million for the fiscal year 2017 on top of that base figure. That would allow us to maintain the additional positions we hope to add this year. We may not be able to add all of them right away. As I indicated, there is time required to bring federal employees on board. It would also help us improve the electronic platform of NICS. Our goal is to have the NICS system operational on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis by the end of this year. That will require a great deal of information technology investment and support, but that is our goal.
And for those whose focus is simply on enforcing existing law, that request is based upon your belief that you need that level of appropriations in order to enforce the law that's on the books today.
That is correct, Senator. In order to provide for the accurate and efficient operation of the NICS system within the 3-day period that has been set forth by Congress, in order to allow us to process the applications in a timely fashion and provide the information that dealers request, that is the basis for this request.
Mr. Chairman, I hope that we could enter into the record. I don't think it's been done yet, but I would like to enter into the record the actual guidance that is the subject of this hearing, if there's no objection. Wanted to enter in the guidance into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I would hope that those that have an opinion, especially those that have a strong opinion on this guidance, would actually take the time to read it, because our second panel is going to include individuals who are going to call it an unwarranted assault on the Second Amendment, an effort to intentionally intimidate and harass law-abiding citizens. There will be those that call it patently unconstitutional. I hope people will read through what this guidance actually says. In summary, it's 5 points. One, that the federal law requires that persons who are engaged in the business of dealing firearms be licensed by the ATF. That's a simple recitation of existing law. Second, that you can be engaged in the business of dealing firearms regardless of the location in which the firearm transaction is conducted. I'm not sure that anyone would dispute that fact. Third, that determining whether you're engaged in the business requires you to look at specific facts and circumstances of your activities. Again, that seems patently clear. Fourth, that as a general rule, you need a license if you repetitively buy and sell firearms with the principal motive of making a profit. But if you only make occasional sales of firearms, you don't need to be licensed. Clear restatement of existing law. And then fifth, a simple explanation about what existing courts have already said to interpret the law. And so to the extent that a lot of the objections may be over this fifth key point, let me just ask you to state clearly for the record, this fifth point on your page of key points, that is simply a recitation of existing court interpretations of the underlying law. There's nothing in there that is a new statement of law. That simply summarizes what existing courts have found relative to who is required to have a license.
That is correct, Senator.
And currently, there is a difference of opinion. There have been different interpretations by different courts as to the interpretation of that law.
Yes, Senator, that's also correct.
And so for those who are trying to determine whether they fall under the law or not, the existing court precedent may be confusing or sometimes hard to track down.
Yes, it is. It is often hard to track down. And also, it's a lot to ask the average citizen to do a LexisNexis search and do legal research and determine, what the courts have said about how they are operating. And in fact, what often happens is that individuals who are operating either at gun shows or smaller sales or even out of other locations will reach out to ATF and they have questions. They say, this is what I'm doing, and I don't know if it means whether I need to apply for a license or not. They ask those questions in person. When they see the investigators at gun shows, they call in with those questions. And so our hope is that this guidance, along with the educational program that ATF will be beginning, which is providing the information to people, will allow individuals to have some clarity about this issue. We don't assume that everyone is a lawyer or even wants to be, but they do have this requirement if they are engaged in the business of dealing in firearms. And it's our hope that this will ease compliance for those individuals who are in fact seeking to comply with the law. And for those individuals who have no intention of complying with the law, this will put them on notice and will remove the defense that this is too confusing or I had no idea that I was falling in this category. It also allows people who are hobbyists and collectors to gain clarity as well about their position because they need not apply for a license.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We reached the point of basic concluding our first panel. Any subcommittee members who have additional questions for the Attorney General may submit them for the official hearing record, and we would request, Madam Attorney General, that the Department of Justice provide responses within 30 days. You generally do. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for your appearance here today, for your time. Senator MIKULSKI.
Mr. Chairman, I must excuse myself from the second panel. I have several Maryland constituents that we scheduled to meet on the issue of hate crimes for which they're being targeted. I need to participate in that. I want to welcome the witnesses to the second panel. I've already read their testimony, a particular acknowledgement for Mr. Barden and what he brings to the table, as well as the practitioners of law. And we look forward to really moving on this agenda to resource the agencies to enforce the laws we have on the books and to find common ground on the President's executive orders.
Thank you, Senator. As the Attorney General departs here, I invite our second panel of witnesses to join us at the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Murphy will sit in my stead at the committee.
Thank you. As our second panel settles in, I would like to make some brief introductions for the next four witnesses. First, I welcome the Honorable Luther Strange, Attorney General for my state of Alabama. Attorney General Strange is recognized as a national leader in advancing the causes of federalism and a limited government by fighting the increasing unconstitutional overreach of the federal government and its assault on individual liberty. He currently serves on the Executive Committee of the Republican Attorney General's Association and is also the chairman of the Southern Region of the National Association of Attorneys General. Next, we will be joined by the Honorable Ken Cuccinelli, the former Attorney General of Virginia. In that role, he challenged many of the federal government's attempts to overreach its constitutional powers. Today, as a private attorney with over 20 years of experience as a litigator, Mr. Cuccinelli now serves as a founding partner and attorney for the United Self-Defense Law Firm. Third, we welcome Mr. Mark Barden, the founder and managing director of Sandy Hook Promise, a national nonprofit organization founded and led by several family members whose loved ones were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School on December the 14th, 2012, excuse me. After tragically losing his son Daniel that day, Mr. Barden has dedicated himself to bringing people together to find sensible solutions that will prevent future tragedies and spare other families the pain of losing a child to gun violence. Finally, we will have Dr. Joyce Lee Malcolm joining us today from George Mason University School of Law, where she works as the Patrick Henry Professor of Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment. Dr. Malcolm is a historian and constitutional scholar active in the area of constitutional history, focusing on the development of individual rights in Great Britain and America. She has written numerous books and articles on gun control, the Second Amendment, and individual rights. Professor Malcolm has previously taught at Princeton University, Bentley College, Boston University, Northeastern University, and Cambridge University. I want to thank all of you for joining us here today, and we will start with Attorney General Strange. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Senator Shelby. Thank you, Senator Shelby. Senator Murphy, I thank Vice Chairman MIKULSKI as well for inviting me here today. I'm honored to accept your invitation to speak about an issue of importance to all Americans, reducing gun violence while ensuring that the fundamental right of law-abiding citizens to bear arms is not infringed. I wish to commend your subcommittee for convening this panel to explore how best to balance these goals because they're not mutually exclusive. My duty as Attorney General is to enforce the law, and I'm here today as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer to deliver the man on the street, the law enforcement officers on the street's perspective on this issue. For the last 5 years, I've witnessed firsthand as Attorney General the challenge of safeguarding the gun rights of law-abiding citizens while also working to deny lawbreakers the ability to use firearms to commit crimes. In those 5 years, I've learned an important lesson. Further limiting the ability of responsible citizens to buy a gun will not keep criminals from getting one. In fact, after I learned I would be testifying before this committee, I reached out to local police chiefs, soliciting their advice on what is working and what is not working in stopping gun violence on the street. I wanted to be able to carry their message based on decades of experience on the front lines of this fight to this committee. These are the men and women who are the first line of defense, or the first people on the scene of a terrorist attack or a violent event, active shooter situation. Again and again, I heard the same thing from these men and women. Number one, enforce the laws already on the books. Number two, prosecute criminals for gun-related crimes. Number three, stop releasing violent criminals from jail before their sentences are completed. They directed their concerns squarely at the federal government, which they see as failing to uphold its commitment to hold criminals accountable for gun crimes. And they have their doubts about the promises they hear coming out of Washington. As one police chief put it, if anyone of any political stripe whatsoever was sincerely concerned about gun violence, they would take a no-holds-barred approach to enforcing the seemingly endless laws relating to guns that are already on the books. Now, I don't think there's anyone in America whose heart doesn't break over the news of mass shootings that take innocent lives. There's no one in this country who opposes making our streets safer. We all want to do everything we can to prevent more gun crimes. But we also must be sure that political actions taken in the name of solving the problem are grounded in facts. They must be vetted by representatives of the American people, and they must not undermine our constitutional rights. 2 weeks ago, the President announced a series of executive actions he asserted would reduce gun violence. And while he may have had the best of intentions, the law enforcement officers in my state, and I dare say around the country, believe these actions will not have a meaningful impact. The centerpiece of the President's order, expanding background checks to close what some would call the gun show loophole, is not only an unwarranted assault on the Second Amendment, but it also will be ineffective in making a significant contribution towards reducing overall gun crimes. It'll be ineffective because less than 1% of illegal gun purchases are determined to come from gun shows, and fewer still are involved in violent crimes. It's our goal to reduce crime and to make our streets safer. The President's actions will not accomplish that. The only practical impact of the President's gun show provision, in my view, will be to intimidate or frighten law-abiding citizens so that they will refrain from selling their guns at all for fear they'll be prosecuted for failure to register as a firearms dealer. So instead of new rules and regulations, a better approach would be to enforce the laws we have by increasing the efficiency of and funding for the existing National Instant Check System, the NICS system. It's critical to ensuring that guns don't end up in the wrong hands. And I think that's the sentiment shared by all the members of the committee on both political sides. We can do better with that system. With more funding and support, the states can ensure that every felony conviction is reported to the system. Because if the information isn't in the system cannot work. And just as importantly, when the system does work, we find felons attempting to buy guns and we prosecute them. Using the same laws that are on the books today, the Bush administration secured 35% more federal gun convictions in 2004 and 2005 than the Obama administration did in 2014. With the exception of a slight uptick in 2012, federal gun convictions have fallen every year President Obama has been in office. If we're not enforcing our laws intended to keep criminals from getting guns, then adding new executive orders on top of those laws, even if well designed, will accomplish nothing. At the same time, the federal government must do more to provide law enforcement tools they need to do their job. And I hear from sheriffs, including a friend from the state of Alabama, who I'm sure you're familiar with, the sheriff of Calhoun County, former president of the National Sheriff's Association, who told me what he needs is more resources from the federal government, not fewer. In fact, he's recently suffered the loss of assets that protect his officers in very dangerous situations. So we can do more. And remember the sacrifice of our men and women in law enforcement. I think sometimes we lose sight, particularly here in Washington, through the acts of a few that tar the whole, and we need to support our men and women in blue. I've had the sad duty, as I know you have, Senator, and I'm sure Senator Murphy and other members of this committee, to attend the funerals of officers who have fallen in the line of duty, either through the result of a criminal, a mentally ill person, or a gang member, etc. Mental illness is a tremendous concern, and I applaud President Obama for focusing on the mental illness issue. My concern is that it shouldn't be done in the manner that he's doing it, but rather should be debated by Congress and this committee to be done in a thoughtful, thorough way. And in conclusion, what we don't want to see, if I may, Senator, is a veteran coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan who has concerns, wants to talk to a counselor, finds himself unable to purchase a gun. Same thing for someone who may turn over his affairs to a family member to handle and then ends up losing their Second Amendment rights. So I thank you again for allowing me to be here. Our Second Amendment rights can be protected. At the same time, we keep Americans safe. Thank you.
Mr. Cuccinelli.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, in addition to being former Attorney General and a current Second Amendment lawyer, I also spent 12 years working in the mental health arena as an attorney. So I have that perspective as well. And I would say that nothing, not one thing, in the President's executive actions related to guns that we're discussing today would have any meaningful effect on tragedies like Virginia Tech in my state or San Bernardino, much less more common gun-related street crime. However, the President's focus on improving mental health care does have the potential to assist in avoiding future tragedies, particularly given that over 60% of all gun deaths are mental health related. There are two basic categories of actions advanced by President Obama in his recent executive actions, those relating to guns and law enforcement and those relating to mental health. Everything the President advocates costs money, so let me begin by saying I am a lawyer, so I have to start with my caveat, correct? That it would be my strenuous hope that given the fact that our national government is astonishingly bankrupt, not merely bankrupt, that this Congress would cut more money than it proposes to spend on any of these programs. Presumably, you would cut lower priority expenditures if you decide that funding more FBI agents or mental health care is of greater importance, as I hope you will. The President's actions directed at stemming gun violence appear to be, in some cases, merely aspirational, and in other cases, intentionally intimidating and harassing of law-abiding citizens in an effort to get them to shy away from selling guns that they legally own. The procedural proposals to more quickly and smoothly run background checks, and more accurately, are unarguable, so long as they're paid for. All of us want the laws on the books to be enforced. And if that can be done more efficiently and effectively than we are doing today, that would be wonderful. However, when the President and the Attorney General seek to intentionally create confusion and ambiguity about when someone selling a single gun might be in violation of a law with 5-year jail penalties, one can only call that dishonorable intimidation of the citizenry by its government. I would note that this jail threat includes a problem found across the entire universe of federal regulatory law. Namely, there's no clear mens rea requirement, no necessity for a finding of culpable intent on the part of the hypothetical offender citizen. This is another of a long list of examples of presidents, it's plural and bipartisan, expanding federal power using regulatory bodies that have been imbued with criminal lawmaking authority. Now our President wants federal law enforcement authorities to crack down on people selling as few as one gun by forcibly classifying them as gun dealers. This is obviously ludicrous, but the President and Attorney General don't seem to care. Please remember to put yourself in the position of the individuals involved. From an individual citizen's perspective, having your own federal government simply investigating you to make sure one gun sale that you conducted privately and innocently, perhaps to then use the money to go buy a different gun, for example, very common, is an excruciating and painfully expensive experience fraught with peril. And that is exactly how the President wants it. His rhetoric surrounding the release of his proposed actions makes it very clear that while he cannot do much, he can threaten much, and that he intends his bureaucracy to torment many of my fellow citizens who also happen to be gun owners. As a lawyer who's worked on hundreds of mental commitment cases and been deeply involved in how my own community's mental health care system interacts with the judicial system, I would urge efforts to improve mental health care at the state and local level to address some of the problems of violence in this country. The federal government's role in such efforts should be purely supportive, as this is one of many types of challenges best addressed at the local level. In addition to the dearth of mental health care available throughout most of our country, as it relates to public safety, we have a challenging balance to strike between patient privacy and liberty, public safety, and yes, liability. It would be my hope that the federal government would do two things, and only two things, in the area of mental health. First, provide funding to expand mental health care in the states by cutting lower priority programs in the federal government. And second, get out of the way of the states. Eliminate all of your federal rules and requirements and trust the states to find ways to provide better and more cost-efficient care over time. They do want to do it. Other than providing funding for mental health care, the President vaguely mentioned the Department of Health and Human Services removing barriers to states reporting information about people disqualified from purchasing guns due to mental health reasons. I'd urge this committee to go much further and urge HHS to cut back and simplify HIPAA more generally, as the impediments to basic, though protected, information sharing cause significant problems and inefficiencies. In the case of the Virginia Tech tragedy, the shooter's Virginia Public High School, which I represented at the time in the Virginia State Senate, had figured out how to manage the shooter's mental health issues, but they were not allowed to talk to Virginia Tech about the subject. Thus, Virginia Tech didn't even know they had a seriously mentally ill student when Cho, the shooter, arrived as a freshman. While we fix that under Virginia law, such opportunities for improved information sharing exist throughout our legal system. I will finish by calling your attention to very serious concerns I have about threats to due process rights referenced in the President's rhetoric. And when I say referenced, I mean his threats, not the due process rights. I did not hear them referenced. The other concern, in addition, at a constitutional level, because I see time is out, that I have is beyond the Second Amendment, beyond due process, is the separation of powers. I heard one senator here already say, gosh, if the Congress won't cooperate with the President, I'm sure glad the President's bypassing Congress. Actually, a lack of cooperation is a decision by the Congress not to change the law. And I have yet to hear a senator or a witness say that the law should be anything other than enforced as it is written. Thank you.
Mr. Barden.
Thank you, Chairman Shelby. Thank you, members of the committee, for inviting me to testify. My name is Mark Barden. A little over 3 years ago, I was a professional musician, a husband and a father, enjoying a simple, happy family life. I had the opportunity to be home with my children most of the day. My wife, Jackie, grew up in the Bronx and put herself through school to pursue her passion, which is teaching. We now live in Newtown, Connecticut, with our 3 beautiful children, James, Natalie, and Daniel. Daniel was our youngest, and an absolute light of happiness and joy. Daniel's sense of awareness, empathy, and tenderness transcended his 7 years in a way that prompted many to refer to him as an old soul. In school, Daniel earned the reputation as the sweet little boy who would ask to sit with someone who was sitting alone or having a bad day. In fact, some of the parents of Daniel's kindergarten peers asked to have their children placed with Daniel again in 1st grade. And at home, Daniel was a bastion of ethics and respect. For instance, at dinner time, he would scold James and Natalie if they attempted to pick at their food before my wife and I were seated at the table. And he also insisted that we offer a prayer of gratitude before we enjoyed our dinner. I don't mean to sound like a braggy parent, but I think it's really important. I think, especially in this context, that you take a moment to consider the humanity and the personal impact of what has been taken from us and what is at stake here. My family and I had what we considered an idyllic existence and an ideal life. And it all changed on the morning of December 14th, 2012, when a gunman wielding an AR-15 semi-automatic assault rifle equipped with 30-round magazines shot his way into Sandy Hook Elementary School and shot and killed 6 educators and 20 first-grade children. And one of those children was my sweet, precious Daniel. In an instant, the little boy who danced around our house and rescued worms from the sun and held doors open for strangers was gone forever. In the days and weeks following Daniel's murder, like all of us, James and Natalie were bewildered and heartbroken with questions that Jackie and I were ill-equipped to answer. Questions like, why would somebody do this? How could this happen? And so in an effort to try to answer those questions, and through the course of research in hopes of answering those questions, we've learned that over 30,000 people are killed as a result of gun-related tragedies in the U.S. every year. That's 89 people, including 7 children, every single day. Gun-related fatalities are on track to exceed deaths by car accidents nationally and already do in some states. And this is unacceptable. I have subsequently made it my life's work to try to identify realistic, sustainable solutions and ultimately save other families from having to live this never-ending pain. I'm now one of 3 managing directors of Sandy Hook Promise, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing the numbers of gun-related tragedies down through prevention programs. The bottom line here is that we as a nation, as Americans, as individual members of our families and our communities, have to do better. Shamefully, Congress has done nothing to address this epidemic, and thankfully, President Obama and Attorney General Lynch are doing what they can within their authority as our elected leaders and President Obama as a father to take meaningful steps toward protecting our nation's children and making our communities safer. The package of executive actions the President is offering will help enforce laws already on the books. Adding staff and resources to the existing background check system will facilitate a faster, more efficient transaction for law-abiding citizens who wish to purchase firearms. Since many guns used in crimes have been stolen, reporting lost or stolen guns in transit will help minimize the number of firearms that end up in the hands of criminals through this pipeline. Applying better technology to firearms and making them safer will cut down on tragedies across the board, from stolen guns, accidental discharge by children, and suicide. The President has also proposed increasing funding and resources to be made available to bolster and improve our mental health care system. Access to quality mental health care is critical to early identification and treatment for individuals who may be on the path to hurt themselves or somebody else. I am before you today as an informed, proud American who knows these modest proposals will go a long way toward not only saving lives but also improving quality of life. I'm also before you today as a grieving father who knows firsthand the cost of inaction. So I'm asking you guys to think of my sweet little Daniel and what was lost here, and the 90 American families who will lose a loved one today, and the 90 American families who will lose a loved one tomorrow, and so on every day until we do something. President Obama is trying to do something. Please help him.
Dr. Malcolm?
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me today to discuss this important issue. We're here today because on January 5th, President Obama announced plans to impose increased gun control measures on the country without obtaining the legislative approval of Congress. Certainly, gun safety is a central duty of government, and we're all very dismayed by the terrible incidents and rash of shootings that have taken place, most recently in the President's hometown of Chicago and Baltimore, terrorist murders in San Bernardino, California. The President has the authority and, in fact, the duty to see that existing laws are well enforced. However, members of Congress have not ignored the problem. They're sensitive to the need to balance the fundamental constitutional right of Americans to firearms for self-defense with government measures to keep persons likely to misuse weapons from obtaining them. And I must say I'm happy to see that Congress and the Senate debating about helping do something about those who are mentally dangerous to themselves and others. However, the President, thwarted in the effort to get his ideas through Congress, is acting on his own initiative to address gun violence. And there's a fundamental problem whether his measures without congressional approval are constitutional. And I'd like to address two of these proposed measures that I believe fail the test of constitutionality. The President certainly has many opportunities through executive orders and actions to direct federal agencies in the execution of the law, but the Constitution forbids him from changing the law. And this is what he means to do with his plan to expand the definition of gun dealer. Current law requires individuals, as you've heard, who are in the business of selling guns to get a federal license and perform background checks on buyers. Obama would now expand this to require everyone who sells even a few guns and who federal law expressly excludes to get a federal gun dealer license and perform background checks. And as you heard from the Attorney General, the administration really is not clear on how many gun sales would require a seller to obtain a license, the penalty of which is up to 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. The ATF has explicitly warned that under the 1968 Gun Control Act, when this type of licensing for kitchen table gun sales was upheld and part of the law, that the courts upheld convictions for failing to have a license when as few as 2 firearms were sold in a year. In short, President Obama is planning to alter present law in opposition to the explicit will of Congress. Is this permissible? In the famous case of Youngstown Sheet and Tube, in which President Truman was not allowed to carry out his planned seizure of steel mills, Justice Johnson explained the scope of a president's power to take unilateral action. What he did say was that when and I'm quoting here, when the president takes measures incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb. for then he can rely only upon his own constitutional powers, minus any powers of Congress over the matter. Courts can sustain exclusive presidential control in such a case only by disabling the Congress from acting upon the subject. And he warns presidential claim to a power at once so conclusive and preclusive must be scrutinized with caution, for what is at stake is the equilibrium established by our constitutional system. The president's action to alter this law unilaterally is plainly unconstitutional. I just have another minute, but I would like to also mention the president's plan to put people who are on the no-fly list from being able to purchase a gun. And I think many of us have heard of people like former Senator Edward Kennedy, who was surprised to find his name on the no-fly list. It's compiled in secret. For the last 5 years, the American Civil Liberties Union has challenged the law's operation. It's extremely hard to get your name off the list, and there doesn't seem to be any due process to do so. The ACLU is representing people including 2 Marine Corps veterans, one of whom is disabled, a U.S. Army veteran, and a U.S. Air Force veteran. And in an article that their project manager for National Security Project wrote, she claims, until the no-fly list is fixed, it shouldn't be used to restrict people's freedoms. If that holds true for their freedom to travel, certainly also they shouldn't have their Second Amendment right for self-defense impugned as well. Thank you.
Thank all of you. I'll start with you, Attorney General Strange. According to the President's executive actions, the U.S. Attorney General will begin a new dialogue with states to ensure the robust provision of data into the National Instant Criminal Background System. Yet in recent years, as we've noted, his budget has proposed to cut the funding for the NIC program. That's grants to states and local law enforcement agencies that help to make technology upgrades that enable better criminal data sharing, that's been pointed out here. Congress has balked at the President's proposal. This committee has balked at it and instead restored funding levels for these important grants. Attorney General Strange, how have the President's disjointed funding priorities for Justice Department grants and other state-related support programs impacted communities in our state of Alabama and elsewhere?
Senator, they've not been helpful, and I want to commend the leadership here in this committee for its support of local law enforcement, because I think, as it's been made abundantly clear, without the resources, the states cannot adequately get the information to the NCIS, the instant check system. Without doing that, we have a system that's functionally broken, and that's a very detrimental thing for law enforcement in our states. And I don't think I'm speaking just for Alabama here. I think as chief law enforcement official, every law enforcement official at the state level would say that. And I did some checking. Even though we've had a requirement to provide this information for some time, it's only recently, within the last year, that we've received any money at the state level to develop the technology and all the information that's needed to put that information into the federal database.
But shouldn't this be a high priority for the President as well as this committee?
So I think it's the best thing this committee could do would be to make that the highest priority, to allow the states to fund that information, put it into the system so that we can identify gang members and others who are out, who would attempt to violate the law.
What Senator Lankford pointed out earlier in the committee, and I think you were here, I thought that was spot on. Mr. Cuccinelli, in your public service as the Attorney General of Virginia and in your position as state senator at one time, you've been a strong supporter of the Second Amendment rights. Now, as a founding partner in the United Self-Defense Law Firm, which focuses on providing counsel in the area of self-defense rights, you are continuing to focus your career on the protection of the Second Amendment rights. First question, do you believe that the President's executive actions to implement new gun control measures will have a deterrent effect on violent gun crimes in our country?
The answer to that is a simple no. What he's done in the area of guns is so thoroughly indirect as it relates to actual crime occurring either on the street or when you have these tragic mass shootings and mental health related incidents. There can't be a connection. Anyone contemplating crime, when you think of deterrence, you think of them contemplating the consequences. This will have nothing to do with that.
You spent a lot of time, your background, dealing with the mental health issues that face all of us in this country. How can we do more there, and what would you recommend?
Well, when your exchange with Attorney General Strange, you noted states reporting information, and one of the lessons learned out of Virginia Tech for us was, in the case of Cho, he had encountered our mental health system, but he hadn't been formally adjudicated without his objection for mental health incapacity. However, he had submitted under within our court system to mental health treatment, and because he went that route rather than resisting the adjudication, he wasn't reported to the NICS system. We have fixed that in Virginia, and I believe a lot of other states learned some of our informational lessons, if you will. If you look about a year to 2 years after Virginia Tech, you start to see in the data a much higher rate of reporting of these sorts of people to the NICS system, because we don't want them to be able to purchase firearms. And that was a failure of a system that we thought would cover this area in Virginia. And I think a lot of other states are learning from that mistake and fixing it.
You're not saying we've solved the problem, but
not at all.
We've taken some steps in the right direction.
We have taken some steps in the right direction. You heard statistics earlier today about the number of gun checks, 23 million or so. And in Virginia, and I'm sure it's true in Alabama as well, we stop hundreds, if not thousands, of gun sales already, and many of them being caught up in the system because of the information provided this way. And those information blocks are substantial. That is the one way that we might have changed the outcome at Virginia Tech. With a lot of these incidents, it's hard to find any way to have changed the outcome based on the kinds of regulatory impositions the President is talking about here.
Sir, the executive actions which we've been talking about, and I call it chipping away at the Second Amendment rights here, how would what the President's proposing infringe on the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens?
Well, to take the word you used earlier, the deterrent, the impression given to those operating as individuals, though not in their mind conducting the business of gun sales, is that they're being intimidated here. They're being harassed. You know, the Attorney General kept saying that they were clarifying. They were clarifying. And I have to say, I was sitting back there thinking, she knows what this word means. And that is not what they're talking about. They're holding a 5-year prison sentence out over the heads of anyone who isn't a gun dealer and who by any objective standard ought not be considered one, but who does sell a gun. And the Attorney General has said, one is enough to fall under their umbrella. And with penalties like that, the obvious intent is to deter people from even considering making those otherwise and objectively entirely legal sales.
But millions of Americans, millions own guns, and I, for one, I have sold a gun and taken the money to buy another gun, but I'm not a gun dealer.
Yes.
And so forth. But under the Attorney General's recommendation, the President's recommendation, that could curtail my rights to do that, could it not?
Well, and that's how it affects your actual exercise of the Second Amendment. If you're a law-abiding citizen, and I'm a gun owner, I've done exactly what you just described, Senator. I've sold one gun and bought another one to kind of upgrade in the in kind of gun I own. And the idea here, in my impression, from the President, the Attorney General on down, is that they want folks in that situation to think twice, to maybe not be comfortable selling that gun except directly to and from a firearms dealer where there's background checks going both ways. And so the ultimate effect is to slow down the opportunity to legally purchase by law-abiding citizens firearms. That's where the imposition on the Second Amendment comes.
Chipping away at our constitutional right.
Yes, sir.
Do you believe that rather than saving lives, the President's executive actions could result in more lives lost through the violation of the Constitution guaranteed right to self-defense?
Well, certainly one of the things that is little discussed in situations like this is the defensive use of guns, is the actual use of guns for protection. If you go 5 years before Virginia Tech, we had another school shooting down in Southwest Virginia, an Appalachian Law School, where a student came onto the campus, shot and killed 3, and was stopped by 2 students who ran to their cars and got their guns.
Okay.
And that person, unusually enough, simply surrendered. Normally when confronted, someone with mental health issues who has gone on this, they actually take their own lives most of the time, statistically speaking. But there it was used 5 years before Virginia Tech as a protective measure. And there's no compilation of those occurrences anywhere that I know of, and yet we see them all the time. In my law firm, those are the kinds of people we're defending. We have hundreds of clients. We have never had a client inappropriately use a gun. We have defended clients who have drawn their guns in defense and had to then protect themselves from a prosecution, for instance, and all of those have been resolved favorably. But that is understated here. There's no questioning the tragic outcomes that happen time and time again in this country. But it is also the case that Second Amendment rights are exercised and guns drawn to protect people, to defend families, to stop crimes that are in process.
Just share with us for a minute something we all believe in and we're taught and practice. We have a right to defend ourselves, do we not?
Absolutely. It's a natural right, and we're a natural law country, and it's what the Second Amendment, as one of the justices, I believe it was Scalia, said, didn't give us this right. It preserved the right that we already had as a matter of natural law.
Thank you. Professor Malcolm,
Yes.
the President has announced that stricter standards, not passed or vetted, evaluated with Congress, will be applied by the ATF to determine if the seller of a gun, quote, is engaged in the business of selling firearms, end quote, and required to perform background checks. My question, do you believe that the President's announcement of an undefined measurement for determining when a gun seller is, quote, engaged in the business of selling firearms and thus required to perform background checks will result in harassment and legal consequences for law-abiding citizens who are simply engaged in constitutionally protected firearms transactions, as Mr. Cuccinelli and I discussed?
Yes, yes, I do. And in addition,
and why? Explain why.
Well, because as the Attorney General said, we keep explaining and getting all these calls. He would not say how many guns were required to put someone in the category of being a gun dealer. Right now, the law is quite explicit that it has to be someone whose main business is selling guns. And the law explicitly exempts, and Congress explicitly exempted the casual gun seller from that. And they seem to be blurring that definition and really thwarting the will of Congress, because I think Congress took pains to make sure that it would not include people who were just occasional gun sellers.
Do you think that this announcement by the President will have a chilling effect on citizens who merely want to exercise their constitutional rights? I use myself as an example. I have guns, and I've bought guns, and I've sold guns, and upgraded, and I believe I have that right to do it. I'm not a gun dealer.
You're not a gun dealer, no.
I'm not a gun dealer, but
no.
if
sure
this went into effect, I might say, well, gosh, somebody might come after me for doing that. Yet I might sell the gun to a judge or somebody, you know, a good citizen or a prosecutor or lawyer or something like that.
Well, it's bound to have a chilling effect, especially when they've announced that the punishment for not getting that license as a gun dealer is up to 5 years in jail and a fine of $250,000, not counting additional punishment for not doing a background check. So with that kind of draconian punishment, threat and no explicit explanation of how many would require you to be listed and get a license. I think
in a way, it'd be the intimidation syndrome, would it not?
Yes.
Out there saying, you better be careful. In other words, I have these rights, but I better be careful to exercise them. I better do this because of somebody signed an executive order infringing on my constitutional rights. Is that fair? Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and when the ATF has made a point of saying that that in the past they prosecuted someone for selling as little as 2 guns in a year, I mean, that's sort of a clear of what their intentions are.
Dr. Malcolm, you spent a great deal of your professional life studying constitutional rights, Second Amendment, and so forth. Is the Second Amendment just as important to the well-being of this country as the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and so forth?
It certainly is, because it embodies your right to self-defense, which has been mentioned. And no right is more important than your right to defend yourself and your family. And so it absolutely is extremely essential. And there are countries where people do not have the right to self-defense and are supposed to depend on the government, and no government can protect everyone all the time. So it, tends to be ignored, as Mr. Cuccinelli said, is these self-defense uses of guns. And while the FBI doesn't record self-defense uses of guns, it's been estimated from studies that there's something like 1.5 million of these a year, where law-abiding citizens protect themselves and their families, for the most part just having to show a gun to stop a crime from taking place.
Have you seen any administration, have you seen anybody in recent years or even in past years in the presidency that would look at part of our constitutional makeup and attack this amendment, Bill of Rights, or attack this part of the Constitution, like this administration?
I think they've been rather clear that, if they had their just desserts, as it were, their preference, that they would ban guns. I mean, the president spoke glowingly of Australia's buyback and banning of guns for its people. I think that if they could, they would. And I always find it interesting that when they talk about the Second Amendment, they like to refer to hunting. That, it's fine to have a gun for hunting. Hunting does not rise to the level of a constitutional right. It's self-defense that does.
That's self-preservation, Mr. Chairman? Self-defense is self-preservation.
Yes.
Is it not, Mr. Attorney General? Absolutely. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your very candid testimony. I sort of feel as if this is a hearing on a document that I haven't seen. And so I want to explore some of the inconsistencies between the interpretation of 3 of our witnesses and the words on the page. But first, I want to just start with you, Mr. Barton. I want to thank you for your advocacy in the face of unimaginable grief. And I want to specifically thank you for the holistic way in which Sandy Hook Promise has attacked this problem. We're sitting here talking about the ways in which we can change the enforcement of gun laws in order to prevent homicides. But your organization recognizes that the way in which we attack the issue of gun violence is not simply through changing gun laws or better enforcement of gun laws, but also through increased efforts to buttress mental health resources or to increase gun safety or to prevent violence in the first place. You have a much broader agenda, don't you?
Absolutely. And I think, I hear words like attacked and this adversarial approach, and I think we should all be on the same page here. I think really we should be looking for solutions where we can agree that we need to move forward. Something has to be done. And this this situation, the problem of gun-related tragedies, is huge and broad and complex, and no one law will fix it all, no number of laws will fix it all, nothing will fix it all. But we have to approach it in a more, as you said, holistic way, Senator.
But one of the reasons that you do focus on the issue of gun laws is because the research that you've looked at makes it pretty clear that states that make it harder for criminals to access guns have lower rates of gun homicide. And in fact, a very recent report from Johns Hopkins comparing Connecticut's law against Missouri's law and the effect of gun violence rates and gun homicide rates in those two states suggests that there is a real connection between the laws on the books with respect to the easy access of guns to criminals and rates of gun homicide.
Yes, that's correct, Senator. There is clear evidence-based research conducted by Johns Hopkins that clearly indicates that the permit to purchase regulation actually has reduced homicides by 40%. It has reduced suicides by over 15%. And those numbers are reflected in the inversion in states like Missouri that do not have this law, where homicides have risen by 40% in the same time period. Suicides have gone up in 15%. And it comes down to access. And what we're talking about here is the whole fabric of this with regard to access, with regard to prevention. You mentioned my organization, Standing for Promise, is looking, we do a lot of work in the space of prevention and finding these individuals who are on the path to violent behavior and getting them to the help that they need. And so there should be, we should be bolstering our mental health system. We should have a better legislation and mental health reform in place for a place to get these people to the help that they need.
So let me get at this inconsistent reading of the words in the guidance here. So let me start with you, Dr. Malcolm. I just want to make this clear for the record. You spent a decent amount of your written testimony in the last portion of your verbal testimony talking about a conversation about including individuals on the no-fly list on the list of those that would be prohibited to purchase guns. Let's just make it clear for the record that is not in the President's executive order. That is the subject of this hearing today, correct?
The President said that he wanted to include people on the no-fly list in the background check so they would not be able to buy guns.
Right, but he's asked Congress to make that change. He has not included that in, let's just make it clear.
It was one of his proposals.
But that's not in the executive actions announced.
It was one of those he announced. That's how I know about it.
For the record, it was not in the set of executive
then where did it come
actions that he announced. He has requested that Congress make that change, and the President has acknowledged that that is a subject that is within the jurisdiction of Congress, not within the jurisdiction of enforcement of existing law. So I think it's important to point out for the record that that is not part of the underlying executive actions. Second, I just want to make it clear, you said in your testimony, or maybe in answer to a question from Senator Shelby, that he announced that the penalty for violating the existing law with respect to who needs to be licensed is a certain period of time in jail.
I said announced. That he announced, then I misspoke. The penalty is listed as, on the record, that's part of which you read.
That's the existing law, correct?
That is existing law.
That's existing law.
That's
and I think this, speaks to part of our disagreement. If the very notion of expressing what the penalty is for violating the law equals intimidation, then that is a very different reading of our set of criminal statutes than many of us have come to understand. So that's a simple recitation of the existing penalty.
But when you imply that a whole lot of people who are not at the moment under the law are going to be and will face that penalty, then I think that it is important.
Well, so then let's get to that implication. So thank you very much, Attorney General Strange, for being here today. You used strong words in referring to the President's executive order. I think you talked about this being an unwarranted assault on the Second Amendment. And I think this is where we get down to a question of the words on the page versus your perceived intention. And maybe we can all concede that it's a little difficult for us to understand what sits in the thoughts and minds of the individuals who write laws and write guidance. And so we're left first with the words on the page. So maybe just share with me which of these sort of 5 key points that are in this guidance do you perceive to be the unwarranted assault on the Second Amendment? Or is that interpretation dependent on an interpretation of intentions that you've derived independent of what the Attorney General has testified to today?
Well, I think I would adopt the comments of my colleague, Senator Cuccinelli, and I think Senator Shelby's already sort of gone into that detail, and I'm happy to answer that question. But I'm really jumped at the opportunity to come at the Senator's invitation because I wanted to deliver the message from the men and women on the street, the people who are actually going into the catastrophic active shooter situations, and get their opinion and bring that here. And not only to criticize the President's proposal, because I don't think it's the right way to go about addressing these issues we all care about, but to point out that the areas that do make a difference and where the Senate committee here can make a difference have been neglected. And one example is the...
But I guess my question, let me just, because I'm going to run out of time, I know I'm already over, but what specifically, what's the section here that you perceive to be intimidating? What's the language here that's the assault on the Second Amendment, just to the extent that you can point me to the provision that you're referring to?
If I could follow up with that, I'd be happy to, Senator. I don't have it in front of me, but I can tell you that the sentiment of the men and women in law enforcement, the people that I work with every day who are devoted to solving the problems that we all care about, preventing it.
I appreciate that. I think you have an obligation to point to the specific provisions, given that we're talking about it. But let me, I think, Mr. Cuccinelli, you might be jumping at that opportunity, so let me just turn it over to you. I get the sense that you probably have the most problem with the recitation of the existing court cases that are currently the way in which you would interpret whether you are subject to the requirement or not. And so you repeatedly referred to this suggestion that if you sell only one firearm, that you may be required to obtain a license. That's included in a section which simply recites existing court cases. So let me just ask you the simple question. Do you dispute any of the information that's listed in this section relative to the description of existing court cases on this question of who has to get a license?
Yeah, my concern partly arises from experience. I mean, in my 4 years as Attorney General of Virginia, I dealt with the business end of the spear of the federal government as they overread, if you will, overinterpreted, and thereby used very aggressively authority they didn't have. And we beat them back occasionally, but we had to do it. And they're counting on the fact that corporations and individuals don't want to fight with the federal government. And with the intimidation you're asking the professor about is the rather vaguely worded, despite the Attorney General's continual use of the word clarify, it is exactly the opposite of what they are doing. They are opening the door to the application of 5-year jail penalties to a bunch of people who right now, under the existing law, believe they understand that they don't fall under that umbrella.
What's vague here? Point me to so what I see is a recitation of the existing law and then a recitation of existing court cases that are public records. So what of that is intentionally vague, such as to be intimidating?
Senator, if all they wanted to do was actually apply the laws that exist today, they wouldn't have to say anything. They could just keep pressing ahead and make greater efforts, hopefully, to apply the existing laws.
But what's vague here?
When you bring all of it together, and you all, or the Attorney General with one of you on the panel, was discussing circuit-to-circuit differences, for instance. Fourth Circuit, which I am in, we have some unique case law, but the people who live in the Fourth Circuit who do think of themselves as dealers and who do make a business of selling recognize what that law is. They have come to understand it. And so now you're introducing at the national level a new threat of enforcement that there wouldn't be any need for if the law wasn't going to change. So what are they to think? They're to think that something has now changed and the 5-year penalty is being held out over their heads in a way that they now have to be concerned about. That intimidation has been used in all sorts of regulatory arenas by this administration for 7 years.
Thank you. I just want to go back to the law. This is the U.S. Code, and I'm going to quote from it that y'all are familiar with, for the record. As applied to a dealer in firearms, as defined in Section 921, so forth, a person who devotes time, attention, and labor to dealing in firearms as a regular course of trade or business with the principal objective of livelihood and profit through the repeated purchase and resale of firearms. But such terms shall not include a person, this is very important, who makes occasional sales, exchanges, or purchases of firearms for the enhancement of a personal collection or for a hobby, or who sells all or part of his personal collection of firearms. So the president, I believe, is trying to assault the constitutional rights, and also he's trying to get around the law. The law is clear here, is it not? Am I wrong?
I think he's trying to eliminate the last clause of that section.
That's right. By executive order and not through Congress in a debate. Is that correct, sir? Y'all agree with that? You agree with that, Doc?
Can I make a comment on that? I think there's a part of that everyone seems to be missing in that there are other factors that have to be included. It's not just that you're one person that you're saying is selling one gun, and that's why they don't have a number. Because the widow whose husband dies and she's trying to sell off his collection would not be subject to this.
Can
I finish?
Oh,
go ahead.
Because you'd asked me.
So, I'm sorry, can I finish?
Let her answer. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the Congress has been very explicit that it wanted to prohibit the inclusion of the occasional gun seller from having to be listed as, get a firearms license as a gun dealer. And you've read us the existing law, but the president has announced that he wants to change the existing law.
I didn't read you the existing law. I read you the actual executive action that we're debating today.
Okay, but the president announced that he wanted to include the people that, the so-called gun show loophole, the people who sell here or there, the occasional.
He wants to include stuff, rights that are protected in the law.
Yes. So
he wants to do it by executive order. Is that correct?
That's as I
believe that's right.
Yeah.
So may I finish, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Chairman?
Go ahead, Mr. Barker.
So what this is really, let's look at what this is actually aimed at, and it's aimed at these people who have emerged, especially with the internet, to sell thousands of firearms while they have another, maybe they're used car salesmen. That's their job. But in the meantime, they may not have a store, but they have business cards. They may be selling firearms in their existing packaging. They are clearly in the business, and that's why they haven't defined a certain number to delineate who's in the business and who's not, so that people who shouldn't be captured are not captured, like the widow who's trying to sell her husband's, or Mr. Cuccinelli who wants to upgrade, will not be captured in this.
Well, I think a lot of us would agree that we want to keep guns out of people with mental health problems, criminals, terrorists, and everything else. But we want to, I hope, always protect the right of gun owners and people who own guns, have guns, sell guns under the Second Amendment. That's
I don't see any infringement on that in any of this language.
You agree with that, Mr.?
I do, but I would note that I think Mr. Barton raises a legitimate issue about the change in the nature of sales with the growth of the internet. I mean, I'll just name Craigslist, for instance, and there's nothing wrong, I don't think anybody would object to making sure that folks using those avenues are properly either licensed if they should be.
Follow the law.
As it exists now, but new law wasn't needed for that. However, the enforcement, the request for additional enforcement tools perhaps would get to exactly those kinds of folks. I would note for you that, you know, what's called the gun show loophole is not a new debate. 40 miles west of here, we have the largest gun show on the East Coast. We have it because of legislation I got in the state Senate that Mark Warner, one of your colleagues, signed as governor at that time. And we went through that gun show, over 1,000 tables, over 400 of them with gun sales going on, 400 tables, with the proprietor filming it. and went to every single seller of guns and asked every single one if they were a licensed dealer. Every single one of them was, except 6. Of the 6, we asked 3 of them, well, what are you doing? Why are you here selling these guns? And all 3 of them had the same answer, that they were all private collectors liquidating part of their collection. All 3 of them. Which
is covered here in the law.
It is covered in the law. In the debate just in Virginia, it happened every year. There's never a year off from this debate. There was never identified in Virginia a purchase referring to the statistics that Attorney General Strange mentioned, that came from the Clinton administration, by the way, where we found criminally used guns being bought and sold at gun shows. Okay. This didn't happen in Virginia.
Just didn't.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I know we're wrapping up, just a concluding thought. Listen, I think at the heart of this issue is simply a disagreement about what the words on this page say. And I think it's important that when pressed, none of our witnesses could actually recite any actual verbiage in the order which speaks to this claim of intimidation. And I think the exception that you talked about, Mr. Chairman, for those that are just engaging in personal sales from their collection is important, but that's in the guidance. I mean, the guidance says very specifically, if you only make occasional sales of firearms from your personal collection, you do not need to be licensed. You need to be licensed if you repetitively buy and sell firearms with the principal motive of making a profit. I think there's just a fundamental disagreement about what is actually on the page here, and I hope that as we have this debate, it's not anchored in perceived intentions of what the administration is quietly, secretly planning to do, but that the objections are based in the actual text of the executive order. And I think that's what we've been missing in this hearing so far. We've been missing disputes and objections that are anchored in the actual text. If you come back to the text, it says exactly what we all agree on, which is that we should enforce the existing law, we should require people engaged in the business of selling firearms to get licensed wherever they do so, and that we should let out from under that rubric of regulation those that are just selling firearms occasionally from their personal collection.
Well, thank you, Senator. I believe at the end game should be that we all uphold the Constitution, all amendments, including the Second Amendment. I want to thank the witnesses for coming here today, and we've had an interesting debate, and I think that timeliness is good. Any questions that would be submitted to you, we would hope you would answer, like we said, within 30 days for the record. The subcommittee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What I'd be interested in is
I'm reading your testimony. I'm sorry for the loss of friends. You mentioned you attended your own well, and it looks very similar to my attended also my son.
We probably have in our as well. What's happening now because of the attention to the mental health issue, everything in the countries of is jails, warehouse. So if you go to a sheriff's office in a small county, somebody's got a mental health issue. It could be anywhere. They are arrested typically. They might be medicated with drugs or they're arrested. They have to go to jail. The jailers don't know how to treat it. They don't do anything. There's no satisfactory program. So we know better than the mental health system that we had at one time. Source, dismantle out the community, so-called community care facilities that go. And what our guys would say, Mr. Pryor was going to the probate judges and please,
it's better to do that because it's not sexy, it's complicated. It's expensive.
So what I'm seeing here in this dialogue now is the African part of this is complexity. So it is true. It's very lack of prosecution, it's mass incarceration, it's lack of prosecution, it's lack of, or it's so
and
broad.
The mental health people are upset about the idea of the privacy. People are told that if they're pregnant, they're going to be reported. So they're against taking
it's so hard to get people to mental health component is really critical. We do have, now I'll go to your website, we have an initiative, I know we had something like this, but we have what we call a Safe Schools Initiative.
Yeah.
We go to every school.
Well, I called Mike to see if we were clear. That's why I was.
Each one of our school districts, we have seven of them, receive an award, I go there and they can be found and we can be a parent, not because of the network, that state like ours. Wealthy counties and communities can afford resource officers there. Then a lot of them don't. They can't do that.
The Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science, their hearing wrapping up on the President's executive actions on gun control. The second panel with two State Attorney General, actually Luther Strange, they're the man on the left, Alabama Attorney General, and the former Virginia Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli, who was actually the first Attorney General in the U.S. to bring lawsuit against the administration under the health care law. They're also hearing today from Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General. She was the first witness this morning, the first half of this hearing.
So much of what we find here is if you look at the paper and fires out there and all this so basically on their smartphone, a lot of this stuff is we can't get our hands on it. Good to see you. So you got to find balance. A few years.
Excuse me, thank you all so much for coming. Senator McCarthy was very disappointed she couldn't stay for the second panel.
Your comments were great. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. I'm glad that they're working on this mental health issue. Are you? It's been, I think, a very high priority for Senator McCarthy and for many on the House. Oh, it is.
You look at the gangs where violence, we see evidence in every city in our communities. It doesn't have to be necessary. There's a lot of gangs, gun deaths. Baltimore, Chicago, and Birmingham in our state. And we have a partnership with the federal government on these gun prosecutors now, and that funding has really gone away because we have someone who is in charge. They're also a felon holder of a gun. They can get a very severe Richmond. That's a huge issue. I wanted to get talking about down there. It's been cut back in our state. We want to get those guys. That's how you can get to the problem that you see in some of the cities.
Just when we talk to the federal agents who are on the ground, not FEMA, those partnerships that they say really helps them move the ball on.
We need the encouragement because some of that's been lost. Yeah. By the way, you're Steve. Good to meet you. I appreciate this opportunity.
Dr. Malcolm, thank you very much for participating.
It just takes years.
Any questions for
Okay. Yeah, there's all this emphasis on the laws it is and their guidance, but the president said
the other side of the
guidance is a word. Yeah, but thanks very much.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So you did very well, but you were like outgunned. But you were a minority opinion.
There you go. Man.
Well, that's why I tried to make common ground. The argument in the size debate and the vice is not getting out. So we need to kind of shake hands, agree to disagree, and try to move forward.
I know, but we're the only.
And do you think it's possible? Because it seemed like,
I think it's possible. It's not going to happen today, but it's possible. In the sidebar conversations that I'm having right now, I see the basic core of human assessment, and from that change will grow.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Hey, how are you?
Hi, Jennifer.
Yeah, that's fine.
Excuse me, Jennifer. Yes, thank you.
We're not recording.
Excuse me.
But that's all right, though.
Pardon me? Pardon me?
What did, I'm just professional interest, degree in
President Obama several weeks ago announcing new executive actions on gun control. The subcommittee here of Appropriations hearing from the Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, particularly on the Justice Department's role in enforcing those executive actions, and again, the second panel as well, including the father of one of the victims of the Sandy Hook shooting. Just want to let you know that we're going to re-air the entire hearing